Hello, my YouTube audience, and welcome back to Crime Whisper. I know many of you love listening to these stories as you drift off to sleep, so before you get too cozy, take a moment to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you enjoy tonight's story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. Japan never fails to fascinate with its endless surprises, making it one of the most cherished travel destinations in the world. Among the countless reasons tourists flock to Japan, one stands out in particular: to experience the birthplace of anime. Over the past decade, anime has evolved into a global cultural phenomenon, captivating audiences far beyond Japan's borders. And at the heart of this phenomenon lies a place called Akihabara, often hailed as the Mecca for anime lovers and admirers of Japanese pop culture. Nestled in the heart of Tokyo, Akihabara attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors every year, giving rise to a cultural movement unlike any other. After World War II, the area served as a local marketplace, a hub where people traded goods on the black market. But over the decades, it transformed, becoming a vibrant symbol of Japan's technological innovation and modern creativity. Today, Akihabara stands as a bustling district, overflowing with electronics shops, gaming stores, manga cafes, and anime-themed attractions. The word otaku is often used to describe someone deeply passionate, even obsessed, with a specific hobby or interest, especially when it comes to anime, manga, or video games. When the term first emerged, it carried a negative connotation, associated with people seen as socially awkward or reclusive. But over time, many fans have reclaimed the word, turning it into a proud badge of identity. Otaku culture has shaped Akihabara's landscape, from its businesses to its architecture. The moment you step into the district, your senses are overwhelmed by a dazzling display of color and sound, a kaleidoscope of neon lights, electronic billboards, and the constant hum of activity. It's no surprise Akihabara is also known as Electric Town. Everywhere you look, enormous screens flash with anime characters and futuristic gadgets, while upbeat music spills out from nearby shops. The energy is contagious, especially on weekends, when traffic halts and pedestrians flood the streets, fully immersing themselves in the vibrant pulse of Japanese pop culture. But on June 8, 2008, that energy turned to horror. Around 12:33 p.m., the usual midday bustle was shattered by screams that echoed through the streets. A truck had sped through a red light, crashing through barriers that marked a road closure. With terrifying speed, it plowed into the unsuspecting crowd, leaving chaos and devastation in its path. As panic spread, the driver, a man dressed in a beige suit, stepped out. He appeared both disoriented and eerily calm, a knife glinting in his hand. Within minutes, the lively streets of Akihabara were overrun with flashing lights and sirens as 17 ambulances and police units rushed to the scene. Officers drew their weapons, searching for the armed suspect, the man in beige. That man was soon identified as 25-year-old Tomohiro Ka, the perpetrator of one of Japan's most shocking and senseless crimes. You're listening to a special edition of Heinous, brought to you by One Up Media. This episode contains sensitive material and descriptions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. In the quiet suburbs of Aomori, Japan, September 1982 marked a joyous moment for the Kato family as they welcomed their first child, Tomohiro Kato. Located along the northern coast of Japan's main island, Aomori serves as the capital of Aomori Prefecture, roughly a 3-hour flight from Tokyo, though distant from the capital. Aomori carries its own unique charm and cultural depth. Like much of northern Japan, its economy has long been tied to traditional industries such as farming, forestry, and fishing have sustained the people of Aomori for generations. However, Since the 1970s, the city has diversified, placing greater emphasis on manufacturing and service sectors to meet the changing needs of its residents and visitors. During his early years, Tomohiro Kato lived a comfortable life in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Aomo. His upbringing was shaped by two devoted parents who held high aspirations for their children's future. His father, a senior manager at a financial institution, and his mother, a homemaker. Both believed deeply in the value of education and discipline. From a young age, Tomohiro was taught that success came only through hard work and academic achievement, in a society where a stable and prosperous life often depended on good grades and prestigious careers. In fields such as medicine or engineering, education wasn't just important, it was everything. Under this belief, his parents closely monitored his progress, ensuring he excelled academically. And indeed, in elementary school, Tomohiro's performance was nothing short of outstanding. He was among the top students in his class and even became one of the school's best track athletes. Known for his bright and cheerful personality, Tomohiro was energetic and lively, though he occasionally struggled with a short temper. Still, he remained dedicated to his studies and driven to succeed. This determination followed him into high school, where he served as president of the tennis club, showcasing not only his leadership skills, but also his relentless work ethic. Tomohiro's father belonged to Japan's working class, a group widely respected for their loyalty to employers and tireless commitment to their jobs. This dedication to work runs deep in Japanese culture, but it has also led to one of the country's darker social issues, karoshi, or death from overwork. During the 1980s and 1990s, Japan's labor force faced notoriously long hours. Surveys from that era revealed that nearly a quarter of male employees worked over 60 hours a week, about 50% more than the standard 40-hour work week. As his father dedicated himself to his job, Tomohiro's mother took on the full responsibility of raising their children, a common arrangement in Japan at the time. But within the Kato household, this dynamic created immense pressure. Tomohiro grew up under a constant expectation to mirror his parents' tireless work ethic, to succeed at all costs, with no room for failure. That pressure began to weigh heavily on him, and the cracks slowly started to show as he entered his teenage years. The relationship between Tomohiro and his parents began to deteriorate. Arguments became frequent, and he began skipping family meals, distancing himself from home life. While such behavior might seem like typical teenage rebellion, what lay beneath told a far more troubling story. His mother's strictness bordered on cruelty. Records and later testimonies revealed that she demanded perfection from her son. Even a small mistake in his homework could trigger her anger. She would reportedly tear up his notebook and force him to start over. There were also allegations of more extreme punishments. If Tomohiro didn't eat his meals fast enough, she would throw the food on the floor and order him to eat it off the carpet. And most disturbingly, if he failed to recite his multiplication tables quickly or correctly, she would grab his head and push it underwater in the bathtub, leaving him terrified of bath time for years to come. These traumatic experiences left deep emotional scars, compounding the pressure he already faced from his demanding academic and social environment. In 1997, at just 15 years old, Tomohiro began attending Aomori High School, one of the most prestigious schools in the prefecture. But for the first time, he found himself struggling to fit in. He was bullied and ostracized by his classmates, who described him as quiet, strange, and a loner. One student even recalled, "He always seemed alone, I once heard. He walked around school carrying a knife." Isolated and increasingly misunderstood, his grades began to slip. In a class of 360 students, Tomohiro's academic ranking began to fall, a slow but steady descent that marked the beginning of his downward spiral. As Tomohiro's grades continued to decline, so too did his confidence. The boy who had once been praised for his brilliance and athleticism was now struggling to find his footing in a world that seemed to expect perfection from him. By the time he reached his final years of high school, the pressure had become unbearable. His parents' expectations, the bullying from his peers, and his own growing sense of inadequacy began to consume him. He grew more withdrawn, more irritable, and more isolated. Despite these challenges, he managed to graduate and, in a bid to redeem himself, enrolled in a technical college where he studied automotive engineering, a field he believed could offer a stable and respectable career. For a time, it seemed as though things were beginning to look up. After graduation, Tomohiro secured a job at a car parts manufacturing company in Shizuoka Prefecture, a few hours outside Tokyo. He worked as a temporary dispatch employee, assembling components for vehicles, a modest but steady job. However, beneath the surface, the same insecurities and emotional scars from his past continued to haunt him. In the early 2000s, Japan's job market was becoming increasingly unstable, with temporary contracts replacing long-term employment. These so-called dispatch workers, or hack-and-shane, often faced low pay, little security, and constant uncertainty about their future. For someone like Tomohiro, who had already struggled with rejection and self-worth, this instability deepened his sense of failure as his performance at work began to slip. His supervisors reportedly noticed changes in his behavior, mood swings, irritability, and a growing sense of resentment. Then, in May 2008, everything came crashing down. Tomohiro discovered that his work uniform had gone missing. In his mind, this small incident became a symbol of betrayal. He believed his coworkers had deliberately hidden it as a cruel joke. Overwhelmed by anger and paranoia, he erupted, shouting at his colleagues and expressing feelings of hatred toward society. Days later, he was dismissed from his position. This was the final blow. Unemployed, isolated, and feeling as though the world had turned against him, Tomohiro retreated into the online world, a space where he could vent his frustrations anonymously. On Japanese message boards, he began posting dark and disturbing messages, revealing his growing resentment toward society. His words became increasingly violent, filled with anger and despair. In one of his final posts, written just hours before the attack, he wrote, "If I had a girlfriend, I wouldn't have done this. I'm lower than trash. I have no friends, no one to talk to. I'm going to kill people in Akihabara." Those chilling words would soon manifest into a tragedy that would shake the entire nation. On June 8, 2008, a clear Sunday afternoon, hundreds of people filled the streets of Akihabara. The atmosphere was lively laughter, chatter, and the familiar buzz of excitement that always filled Electric Town. No one could have imagined the horror that was about to unfold. At 12:33 p.m., a white rental truck suddenly sped through a red light, smashing into the crowd. In mere seconds, people were thrown into chaos. Screams pierced the air as the vehicle plowed through pedestrians before finally coming to a stop. Then, from the driver's seat, Tomohiro Kato stepped out. He was dressed in a beige suit, holding a knife in his hand. Without hesitation, he began stabbing anyone who crossed his path. Eyewitnesses described the scene as pure terror. People running in every direction, others frozen in shock as he attacked indiscriminately. Within minutes, the once bustling streets of Akihabara were transformed into a scene of devastation. When authorities arrived, the aftermath was horrifying. 7 people were dead, and 10 others were severely injured. Police quickly surrounded the area. Officers drew their weapons, shouting for him to drop the knife. Eventually, Tomohiro was subdued and arrested on the spot. His rampage finally overdot as he was led away in handcuffs. Witnesses recalled his haunting words, "I came to Akihabara to kill people. It didn't matter who." As Tomohiro's grades continued to plummet, his class ranking fell to 300 out of 360 students, and the problems at home grew worse than ever. Neighbors recalled disturbing scenes. Tamahiro being forced to stand outside for hours in the freezing cold of winter, or being made to redo his homework over and over again, until it was perfect, all to impress his teachers. Those 3 years at Aomori High School would become some of the most difficult of his life. Despite enduring humiliation, pressure, and isolation, he persevered long enough to graduate, though with poor grades and a heavy heart. In the year 2000, Tamahiro failed the entrance exam for university. He knew exactly what that meant, not just for his future, but for how his mother would react. Ever since he was a child, she had spoken with absolute certainty that her son would attend the prestigious Hokkaido University and go on to become an engineer. Tomohiro himself had dreamed of becoming an automotive design engineer, but now those dreams were shattered. All he could think about was how to tell his mother that he had failed. No one knows exactly what happened in the Kato household that day, but it's clear that the reaction was far from kind. The following year, he tried again and failed once more. That second failure marked a turning point. His once vigilant, demanding mother seemed to lose interest in him entirely, shifting her attention and affection toward his younger brother. It was as if she had given up on Tamahiro, deciding that her younger son was the more promising investment. This emotional abandonment left deep scars. Tamahiro's feelings of depression, resentment, and anger began to fester toward himself, his mother, and the world around him. Trying to piece his life back together, he enrolled in Nagano Automotive College, studying auto mechanics, and took a part-time job at a car parts company. Perhaps he thought that if he couldn't meet his parents' exact expectations, he could at least get close by working in a field that aligned with their dreams for him. In April 2005, he landed a job at a truck factory in Saitama Prefecture, about an hour outside Tokyo. It seemed like a fresh start, a chance to live independently, to rebuild his life, and maybe even win back his mother's approval. But life in Tokyo was far from easy. His income barely covered rent and basic necessities. Over time, his savings dwindled, and he found himself in a constant state of financial stress. His parents, however, showed little empathy for his struggles. Their indifference only deepened his loneliness. By 2006, Tamahiro had reached rock bottom. He felt overwhelmed, defeated, and utterly alone in a city that offered him no comfort. He often thought, if only I'd studied harder, maybe my parents would still love me. Haunted by regret and crushed under the weight of his failures, he began to spiral. Each day felt like an uphill battle, and in his mind, there was no longer any way out. Then, one cold night in 2006, that despair reached its breaking point. As midnight fell, Tamahiro sat behind the wheel of his car. The streetlights cast eerie shadows across the empty road as he gripped the steering wheel with trembling hands. The engine roared to life as he pressed his foot down harder and harder still. The car surged forward, speeding toward a concrete wall. The world around him blurred, a swirl of lights and darkness. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. He shut his eyes, his heart pounding, his breath catching in his throat, and then impact. The crash was violent. Metal crumpled, glass shattered, and silence followed, broken only by the distant wail of sirens cutting through the night. But somehow, Tamahiro survived. He crawled from the wreckage with only minor injuries, a mild concussion, and a few cuts and bruises. It was as if fate had intervened, refusing to let him go. In the days that followed, he seemed to undergo a quiet transformation. Perhaps, he thought, this was his second chance, a chance to rebuild, to find purpose again. Not long after, around August or September of that same year, Tamahiro received an offer from Kanto Auto Works, a manufacturing company in Susono City. He accepted immediately. The job came with a modest but stable salary, and for the first time in years, his life appeared to have some structure. He worked diligently, earning praise for his reliability and precision. Though quiet and reserved, he was seen as a dependable employee. When his contract came up for renewal, the company extended it for another year, a rare show of faith in a temporary worker. Yet outside the factory walls, Tamahiro remained painfully isolated. He had no close friends, no one to confide in. His only outlet was the internet, specifically the anonymous message boards that were popular in early 2000s Japan. There, hidden behind a screen name, he poured out his frustrations about his loneliness, his anger, his resentment toward society. The anonymity offered comfort, a place to be seen without fear of judgment. But the forums were far from kind. He was often ridiculed, insulted, and cyberbullied, the same rejection he had experienced in real life, now repeating itself online. Those digital wounds cut just as deep, reigniting old pain and fueling the growing darkness inside him. The relentless cyberbullying only deepened Tamahiro's sense of isolation. Every time he posted on the forum, he was met with mockery and hostility. The digital abuse became constant, a cruel echo of the rejection he'd faced his entire life. By June 2008, Tamahiro was reaching his breaking point. That month, Kanto Auto Works, the company where he was employed, announced plans to lay off temporary workers in an effort to cut costs. For Tamahiro, this news was catastrophic. His job wasn't just his livelihood, it was also his lifeline. His small apartment was subsidized by the company, meaning that if he lost his position, he would also lose his home. Then, on June 5th, everything began to unravel. When he arrived at work that morning, his uniform was missing. He frantically searched the locker room, growing increasingly anxious as panic set in. Convinced that his coworkers had hidden it as a cruel prank, he lashed out in anger, accusing them of sabotage. The tension was palpable. His coworkers denied any involvement, but the confrontation left a lasting impression. Consumed by paranoia and fear, Tamahiro stormed out of the factory and never returned. That same day, he turned back to the online forum, a site called Extreme Exchange, revised, and began posting a series of disturbing messages that revealed his growing instability. In those posts, he described his despair, his anger toward society, and his plans to take revenge on the world that he believed had rejected him. This was the moment when Tamahiro Kato snapped the following day. He visited a military surplus store where he purchased 6 survival knives, leather gloves, and extendable batons. Security footage later showed him demonstrating stabbing motions while speaking to the clerk, a chilling foreshadowing of what was to come. On June 7th, he boarded a train bound for Akihabara, Tokyo's famed electric town. Before leaving, he sold his computer and a few personal belongings, using the money to rent a truck, telling the rental company he was preparing to move. The next morning, Sunday, June 8, 2008, Tamahiro began posting again. His first messages appeared just after 5 a.m. and continued until 11:45 a.m. His final message read, "I've arrived in Akihabara. It's pedestrian paradise today, isn't it? Just a few minutes left now." At 12:33 p.m., exactly 48 minutes later, Tamahiro drove his rented truck through a red light at one of Akihabara's busiest intersections. The road had been closed to vehicles for Pedestrian Paradise Sunday, when people could freely walk the streets. From the driver's seat, he watched as the crowd crossed in front of him, hundreds of people, completely unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. Then, without hesitation, he slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The 5-ton truck roared forward, smashing through the barriers and plowing into the crowd. In an instant, bodies were thrown across the street. People screamed. Confusion turned to chaos. At first, bystanders thought it was a tragic accident. Several rushed forward to help the victims. But that illusion shattered when Tamahiro stepped out of the truck, a knife glinting in his hand. He began stabbing indiscriminately, targeting anyone within reach. Witnesses described his attacks as relentless, his face blank, his movements mechanical, as he slashed at strangers in every direction. Within 2 minutes, the streets of Akihabara had descended into panic. A nearby police officer, alerted by the screams, chased Tomohiro down a narrow alley. When cornered, Tomohiro dropped his weapon and surrendered without resistance. It had taken only 2 minutes for 7 lives to be lost and 10 more to be forever changed. He was arrested approximately 1 meters from where the truck came to a stop. As emergency vehicles flooded the scene, 17 ambulances arrived to treat the wounded. Brave bystanders knelt beside victims, trying desperately to stem the bleeding as the sound of sirens filled the air. By evening, the death toll had risen to 7. Among the victims were 2 19-year-olds, while others ranged in age from 21 to 7. 4.3 had been killed instantly by the truck's impact, while 4 more died from stab wounds. 2 days later, on June 10th, Tomohiro was formally charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder in the aftermath. His parents issued a tearful apology to the victims and their families on national television. His father soon resigned from his job and withdrew from public life, returning to Aomori in shame. His mother, overwhelmed by grief and guilt, was later hospitalized for mental health treatment. The tragedy of Akihabara would go on to haunt Japan for years. During his trial, Tomohiro expressed remorse, offering apologies to the victims and their loved ones, but his words could not undo the devastation he had caused. On March 24, 2011, the Tokyo District Court sentenced him to death by hanging. He appealed the decision, but on February 2, 2015, the Supreme Court of Japan upheld the verdict, sealing his fate. Tragically, the suffering extended beyond him. In April 2014, Tomohiro's younger brother, unable to bear the shame and public stigma associated with the massacre, took his own life. And on the morning of July 26, 2022, after nearly 14 years on death row, Tomohiro Kato was executed at the Tokyo detention house before the attack. He had documented his every move online, perhaps hoping that someone, anyone, might intervene. His final messages, written less than an hour before the rampage, read like a cry for help. But no one ever did. Every day, more than 1,000 ships dock at the ports of Singapore, a nation whose lifeblood flows through the sea. From the rhythmic hum of trucks and forklifts to the mechanical worry of cranes, the Lion City's piers are alive with constant motion and noise. But on October 12, 1978, that familiar rhythm came to an abrupt and horrifying halt at exactly 2:15 p.m. A massive explosion tore through an oil tanker named St. Spiros's, docked at Singapore's Jurong shipyard. In an instant, the vessel was engulfed in a fiery inferno. Flames shot skyward, thick black smoke billowed into the air, and the sound of screams pierced through the chaos. It was a disaster unlike anything Singapore had ever witnessed, a catastrophe that would go down as the deadliest industrial accident in the nation's history. The Spiros's explosion claimed 76 lives and left dozens of others scarred, both physically and emotionally, for the rest of their days. Even now, decades later, the tragedy remains etched into Singapore's collective memory. From Waynap Media, this is Mass Murders. Singapore, one of the busiest ports in the world, stands today as a global maritime hub. Massive container ships line the coast. Cranes dominate the skyline, and in the distance, the glittering city rises as a symbol of economic strength. But back in the late 1970s, things were very different. The young nation was still finding its footing, struggling with unemployment, housing shortages, and political unrest. Yet even amid these challenges, Singapore pushed forward with an ambitious vision to transform itself into a world-class port city and industrial powerhouse. As part of that vision, hundreds of ships, cargo vessels, passenger ferries, and oil tankers moved in and out of its ports each day. One of these vessels was a Greek-owned oil tanker known as the Saint Spirosis, registered in Liberia and built in Japan. The Spirosis was a behemoth of modern engineering, capable of carrying over 60,000 tons of crude oil across vast oceans. For its crew, long-haul voyages around the globe were routine. In 1976, the Shell Oil Company in Delaware, USA, commissioned the Spirosis for a vital mission, transporting massive volumes of crude oil from Southeast Asia to the United States. Shell needed a vessel that was large, durable, and efficient, and the Spirosis fit the bill perfectly. To complete these 12,000-kilometer journeys across the Pacific, the ship needed to be in peak condition. That meant frequent maintenance checks and mechanical overhauls to ensure it remained seaworthy. By September 1978, the Spirosis had just finished a delivery, carrying over 60,000 tons of crude oil from Miri, Sarawak to Shell's refinery in Anacoda City. Following this trip, the owners instructed the crew to sail to Singapore for a full technical survey and repair works. Among the scheduled tasks were the replacement of a missing cover for the drip tray and vent pipe leading from the aft starboard fuel tank. Now, for those unfamiliar with maritime engineering, these components are crucial. The vent pipe allows pressure to escape from the fuel tanks, preventing dangerous buildups, while the drip tray catches any leaks that might occur during refueling. Neglecting either of these systems could lead to a disaster. In the days leading up to their arrival in Singapore, the Spirosis underwent refueling, loading more than 4,000 tons of fuel oil to power its voyage. But this refueling created a new and dangerous problem. The ship had exceeded its fuel capacity, and that raised an unsettling question. How could a tanker capable of carrying 60,000 tons of crude oil struggle to handle just 4,000 tons of fuel? The answer lies in the difference between the two types of oil. Crude oil, the raw, unrefined material extracted from beneath the earth, is very different from the refined fuel oil used to power ships and heavy machinery. Crude oil is stored in cargo tanks, designed to handle its properties and density, but fuel oil, being more volatile and combustible, is stored in bunker tanks, which require additional safety systems and venting mechanisms. In this case, the Spirosis fuel storage configuration was operating at the edge of its limits, and that limitation, overlooked during maintenance and refueling, would soon prove catastrophic. The Inferno at Jurong Shipyard, Part 2. However, with carrying a dangerous secret, because the ship had been loaded with more fuel oil than its bunker tanks could handle, the crew and management made a risky decision. They decided to store the excess fuel oil in one of the cargo tanks, a move meant to ensure the ship could reach Singapore without running out of power. But that decision was a ticking time bomb. Crude oil is far more volatile than refined fuel. It evaporates faster and produces flammable vapor, which can ignite under the right conditions. Maritime safety regulations explicitly warn against mixing fuel oil with crude. But on this voyage, that crucial rule was ignored, a choice that would soon have catastrophic consequences. The Spiros left the United States on September 15, 1978, bound for Singapore. As the ship neared Southeast Asia, the crew began pumping out the excess fuel oil from the cargo tanks and diverting it into the aft starboard bunker tank, contaminating it with crude oil residue. By the night of October 6th, after 6 long weeks at sea, the Spiros finally arrived in Singapore waters for a scheduled maintenance check. The next morning, at Jurong Shipyard, hundreds of local dock workers boarded the vessel to dispose of wastewater and residual oil, a routine operation expected to last the entire day. Then, on October 8th, a petroleum inspector from the Port of Singapore Authority boarded the ship for an inspection. His task was to check the cargo tanks and other key parts of the vessel's handling system. But there was a fatal oversight, because the Spiros had diverted its crude oil into a bunker tank. Dangerous vapors were now trapped inside, and yet, during the inspection, these tanks were completely skipped. At the time, it was common practice to overlook bunker tanks, which were considered lower risk compared to cargo tanks. After completing his inspection, the officer declared the ship gas-free and issued a certificate confirming that the vessel was safe for repair. Work unaware of the invisible threat lingering below deck, had he checked the aft starboard bunker tank, he would have found traces of crude oil and flammable gas vapor, enough to ignite under even the smallest spark. Over the following days, more gas-free certificates were issued by port authorities, one after another. Soon, almost every compartment on the Spiros was marked safe, except for one. As of October 12th, the aft starboard tank still hadn't been certified, but the shipyard foreman ignored this. Eager to stay on schedule, they pushed ahead with the repair work anyway. That afternoon, after lunch, more than 100 laborers, dock workers, and crew members returned to the Spiros to resume their tasks. Among them were 3 fitters, Limhak Ho, Isaac bin Abdul Rahman, and Lo Chik Kwang. They were preparing to replace the missing cover of the drip tray on the aft starboard side, the very area that had not been cleared as safe. When they arrived, they saw a work stage already set up 9 feet above the main deck, directly beside the vent pipe outlet. The job seemed simple. Remove 3 bolts and cut 3 new holes into the replacement cover plate. But as Lim examined the bolts, he noticed they were rusted tight. To loosen them, he lit up an oxyacetylene torch, a common tool in ship repairs, but one that produced open flames hot enough to melt steel. As the torch hissed to life, Lim heated the first bolt. When it cooled, he turned his attention to the next, the one positioned near the vent pipe. What he didn't know was that the pipe connected directly to the fuel oil tank below, a tank filled with combustible vapor. And then it happened. The moment the flame neared the vent, a deep rumble shook the deck. Within seconds, a deafening blast ripped through the ship, a massive explosion that tore the Spiros apart. Steel plates were blown into the air like shrapnel. Sections of the deck were ripped open. Pieces of metal flew across the dock, injuring workers on nearby vessels. The explosion triggered a flash fire, engulfing the engine and boiler rooms where dozens of men were working. Within moments, the ship was transformed into a furnace. Panic erupted. Workers screamed as they scrambled to escape the spreading flames, their bodies covered in boiling oil. The air was thick with black smoke, the temperature soaring above 3,000 degrees Celsius. Many tried to run, others collapsed. Trapped inside the inferno, some leaped into the water, their clothes and skin still burning. It was chaos, pure, unimaginable chaos, and on the docks of Jurong, as the ship burned, the once bustling port fell silent, save for the roar of fire and the cries of the dying. The inferno aboard the Spiros raged relentlessly. Within minutes of the blast, thick black smoke billowed into the sky above Jurong shipyard, visible from miles away. The once bustling port, alive with the constant hum of cranes, engines, and chatter, was now drowned in the roar of fire and the wail of sirens. The explosion had ripped through the vessel's hull, sending molten debris and burning oil cascading into the sea. Men who had been working inside the ship moments earlier were now desperately leaping into the waters below, their overalls ablaze, their skin scorched, their screams piercing through the chaos. Workers from neighboring ships and dockyards dropped their tools and rushed to help. Some dove into the water to pull out survivors. Others tried using fire hoses, buckets, anything they could find, but the blaze was far too powerful. The fire had already spread to multiple decks, fueled by the very oil the ship had once carried. When emergency responders arrived, they were met with a scene from a nightmare. The Spiros was engulfed in a wall of flames, and the air around the dock was so hot it shimmered like a mirage. even from hundreds of meters away. The heat was unbearable. The Singapore Fire Service deployed every available unit, and for the next several hours, firefighters battled the inferno with unwavering resolve. Foam cannons roared into action, coating the burning oil in a thick white layer, while medical teams treated the wounded right there on the pier. By the time the last flames were extinguished, hours later, all that remained of the Spiros was a blackened skeleton of twisted metal. The silence that followed was haunting. Then came the grim task of counting the dead. Of the 167 men working aboard the Spiros that day, 76 never made it out alive. Many were burned beyond recognition. Some were never found at all, presumed to have been vaporized in the explosion or swept away by the sea. Those who survived bore terrible scars, both physical and emotional. Dozens were hospitalized with severe burns. Some would never regain full mobility, while others were haunted for life by memories of the screams, the flames, and the smell of burning oil that hung in the air long after the fire had died. The tragedy sent shockwaves throughout Singapore. Families gathered outside hospitals, clinging to hope for news of their loved ones. Others stood at the shipyard gates, holding photographs, praying for miracles that would never come. As the nation mourned, questions began to surface. What went wrong aboard the Spy? How could a ship declared gas-free erupt into such a catastrophic explosion? An official inquiry was immediately launched by the Singapore government, assisted by the Port Authority, the Shell Oil Company, and foreign maritime experts. The investigation revealed a chain of avoidable mistakes, a perfect storm of negligence, miscommunication, and human error. At the heart of it all was the aft starboard bunker tank, the very compartment where Lim Hock Ho had been instructed to work. Despite being contaminated with crude oil residue, it was never properly inspected. Had even a basic gas test been carried out, investigators concluded, the presence of flammable vapors would have been detected and the repair would have been postponed. Instead, a dangerous combination of oil vapor and oxygen had built up inside the tank, and when the flame from Lim's cutting torch came too close to the vent pipe, it ignited the trapped gases, triggering the massive explosion that tore through the ship. The inquiry also criticized the shipyard's management for proceeding with repair work on an uncertified area. They had ignored repeated warnings that the tank had not yet been declared gas-free. Documents later revealed that foremen had been under intense pressure to meet tight repair deadlines, leading them to cut corners in safety procedures. In the end, the Spiro's disaster was ruled an industrial accident, one that could have been entirely prevented. But for the families of the 76 men who lost their lives, that ruling offered little comfort. In the wake of the tragedy, Singapore undertook a sweeping overhaul of its maritime and workplace safety laws. New regulations required stricter inspections, mandatory gas testing, and the establishment of safety training standards for shipyard workers. Every vessel entering Singaporean waters was now subject to enhanced safety checks, a legacy written in blood and fire. The Spiro's explosion stands, to this day, as Singapore's deadliest industrial accident. It serves as a haunting reminder that safety is never optional, and that one moment of negligence can cost dozens of lives. As the sun set over Jurong that evening, the once proud silhouette of the Spiros lay half submerged, broken, and silent, and though the flames had died out, the memory of that day, of the screams, the fire, and the men who never made it home, continues to echo through the pages of history. Part 4. The Legacy of Spiros. In the weeks that followed the explosion, Jurong shipyard became a place of mourning. Rows of white tents lined the pier as the search for remains continued. Families of the victims gathered in quiet anguish, clutching framed photos, staring out toward the blackened wreckage that had once been a ship, and now a tomb. The air was thick with grief, but also with questions that no one seemed able to answer. Why were warnings ignored? Why did no one stop the repairs? And above all, Could this have been prevented? For survivors, the aftermath was unbearable. Those who escaped alive spoke of nightmares that never left. Some could still hear the echo of their coworkers' screams, see the walls of flame rising before them, smell the burning oil that clung to their clothes long after the fire was gone. One survivor said, "It wasn't the fire that hurt the most, it was the silence afterward." The Singaporean government launched compensation efforts for the victims' families, while the shipyard implemented a series of new safety reforms. It was a national reckoning, a moment that forced the country to confront the human cost of industrial progress. By the end of 1978, Singapore had introduced stricter maritime safety laws that would forever change the way shipyards operated. Every tank, every compartment, every vent would now require multiple checks before any torch was lit or any worker was sent below deck. It was a harsh lesson learned in the worst possible way, and though decades have passed since that fateful day, the Spiro's explosion remains etched into the collective memory of Singapore's maritime community. It's a story told in shipyards and classrooms alike, not just as a tragedy, but as a warning. Every time a worker steps aboard a vessel, every time a torch sparks to life, the echoes of the Spiros serve as a silent reminder. Safety is written in sacrifice. The sea has always been both a giver and a taker of life. It connects nations, builds economies, and feeds generations. Yet it also reminds us that one careless spark can turn progress into tragedy. The story of the Spiros isn't just about an explosion. It's about the men who never made it home. The fathers, the sons, the brothers whose lives were lost, not to the ocean, but to the mistakes of those who thought they could control it. And maybe that's what makes this story so haunting. Because sometimes, the greatest danger isn't the sea itself, it's the people who forget to respect it. From Waynap Media, this is Mass Murders. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us next time for another story where tragedy meets truth. Their minds swirled with questions. Was their father still alive? Was their husband among the burned? Would they ever see their sons again? But as the hours passed, the truth became impossible to ignore. One by one, hospital staff emerged, with clipboards in hand, calling out names into the crowded hallways. Some met with desperate hope, others with heart-shattering silence. By midnight, dozens of families had been told that their loved ones would never be coming home. Outside the hospitals, the atmosphere was somber. Mothers wept into towels, fathers stared blankly into the ground, and children clung to the railings, too young to understand what had just happened. The tragedy had struck not only the workers of Jurong shipyard, but the entire nation. In the following days, the government launched a full-scale investigation into the Spiro's explosion. Maritime engineers, forensic experts, and representatives from the Port of Singapore Authority combed through the remains of the burnt vessel, determined to understand what went wrong. Inside the twisted metal hull, investigators found their first clue, a fractured vent pipe leading from the aft, starboard bunker tank, the same tank that had once contained excess crude oil. Tests confirmed what many feared. Traces of hydrocarbon vapor still lingered in the tank. When exposed to a single open flame, the cutting torch used by the fitters, it created a highly explosive mixture of air and gas. The result was instantaneous combustion. The blast tore through the deck, ripping steel apart like paper, and setting off a chain reaction of secondary explosions throughout the ship. In less than a second, the Spiros became a floating fireball. Further inquiries uncovered a web of neglect and miscommunication. The Port Authority's own gas-free certificate had been issued without inspecting the bunker tanks. The shipyard's foreman had ignored the absence of a clearance notice, and the crew, under pressure to meet tight repair schedules, had allowed workers to proceed. Despite knowing that one section of the ship was not certified safe, it was, in every sense, a tragedy born from complacency. In the weeks that followed, The Singaporean government declared a national day of mourning for the 76 workers who had lost their lives. Flags flew at half-mast across the island. Shipyards across the country held moments of silence before the start of each shift. New safety regulations were swiftly drafted, mandating that every vessel undergo comprehensive gas testing, including all bunker and ballast tanks, before any form of hot work could begin. Training programs were expanded, and stricter oversight became the new standard for maritime operations in Singapore. The Spiro's explosion would forever serve as a turning point, a dark chapter that reshaped the nation's approach to industrial safety. Yet, for those who lived through it, the scars never truly healed. Many survivors bore lifelong burn injuries. Others carried invisible wounds, nightmares, trauma, guilt. Some could still recall the faces of friends disappearing behind walls of fire, their screams echoing long after the flames had died. It was like watching the sun fall onto the sea. One survivor recalled, "Everything turned orange, and then there was nothing but smoke. And from that smoke, a hard-won lesson emerged, that safety isn't just a protocol, but a promise one written in the memories of those who paid the ultimate price. In particular, how crude oil could have ended up in the ship's fuel bunker tanks in the first place. To solve this mystery, the investigation team began tracing the Spiro's journey prior to its arrival in Singapore. Every port it docked at, every document it signed, every gallon of oil that had been loaded or transferred on board. As the evidence slowly came together, a troubling picture began to form. Before setting sail for Singapore, the Spiros had completed a long-haul voyage from Sarawak, Malaysia, carrying nearly 60,000 tons of crude oil bound for Shell's refinery in the United States. After unloading the crude, the ship was ordered to refuel, this time with over 4,000 tons of fuel oil, to power its return trip across the Pacific. But here was the problem. The Spiro's bunker tanks, the sections of the ship designated to store fuel oil, didn't have enough capacity for such a large load. Pressed for time, the ship's management made a fatal decision. Instead of reducing the amount of fuel, they stored the excess in one of the cargo tanks, which had previously held crude oil. That decision violated multiple international safety regulations, and it would prove catastrophic. Even though the crude oil was later pumped out and the tank was reused for fuel, traces of crude residue remained, invisible to the naked eye, but deadly in the right conditions. Over the following weeks, as the Spiros crossed the Pacific, the volatile vapors from the crude oil mixed with the new fuel, forming an explosive cocktail inside the tank. When the ship finally arrived at Jurong shipyard, those fumes were still there, undetected, trapped within the walls of the vessel. And then came the second fatal error. The Port of Singapore Authority's petroleum inspector never checked the aft starboard bunker tank, the very tank that contained the flammable mixture. He declared the ship gas-free, believing it was safe for hot work to begin. This oversight, compounded by the shipyard's decision to begin repairs without proper clearance, created the perfect setup for disaster. In the weeks that followed, a formal commission of inquiry was convened to assign blame and ensure such a tragedy would never happen again. Witnesses, survivors, and company representatives were all summoned to testify. Through months of hearings, investigators concluded that the explosion on the Spiros was an avoidable accident, the direct result of negligence, poor communication, and disregard for safety standards. The commission's report was scathing. It found Jurong shipyard guilty of failing to enforce hot work safety protocols, the Port Authority guilty of oversight negligence, and the ship's owners guilty of improper handling of crude and fuel storage. No single person could be blamed entirely, but collectively, their complacency had cost 76 innocent lives. In the aftermath, Singapore was shaken to its core. For a nation still in the midst of rapid industrial growth, the tragedy served as a grim reminder of the dangers that came with modernization. The government immediately implemented sweeping reforms across all maritime and industrial sectors. Mandatory comprehensive gas testing for every compartment on all vessels. Before repair work could begin, stricter training and certification for safety inspectors. The introduction of permit to work, systems to ensure that no hot work could proceed without proper clearance. These changes, born out of loss, would go on to form the foundation of Singapore's world-renowned safety culture today. But for the families of the victims, no regulation could bring back what they had lost. In quiet neighborhoods across the island, funerals were held day after day, simple ceremonies filled with weeping, the scent of incense, and unanswered questions. For many of the widows, their husbands had been the sole breadwinners. For the children, the memory of that day would forever burn into their minds. The day their fathers went to work and never came home. They said it was just routine maintenance. One survivor recalled years later, but that ship was a bomb waiting to explode. It was an accident that never had to happen. A chain of human errors, stitched together by greed and carelessness, and sealed by the fire that followed. 76 souls lost their lives that day, not because of fate, but because someone decided that saving money was worth more than saving lives. In the charred ruins of the Spiros, investigators didn't just find metal and ash. They found the cost of complacency, a missing signature, an unchecked pipe, a spark too close to a tank that should have been empty. The explosion changed everything. It forced a nation to rebuild its safety laws from the ground up, and it burned into the collective memory of Singapore a lesson written in oil and fire, that progress means nothing if people die to achieve it. Decades later, the docks of Jurong are alive again, brighter, busier, safer, but every ship that pulls into harbor, every torch that flickers to life, carries with it the memory of that October morning in 1978, because in the world of industry, safety is written in blood, and the Spiros was the ink that wrote it. Life in a quiet Singaporean neighborhood seemed ordinary enough. Kids played in the void decks. Neighbors exchanged small talk, and the air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked concrete. But beneath that calm exterior, something horrifying was about to unfold. Story 3. In the heat of June 2012, life in a common Singaporean neighborhood seemed ordinary enough. Kids played at the void decks, neighbors chatted over kopi, and the rhythmic hum of HDB life filled the air. Nothing about that Tuesday morning hinted that something dark was quietly brewing behind the closed doors of a humble flat in Yishun. Inside one of those flats lived a family of 4, a hard-working father, a quiet homemaker, and their 2 young children. To anyone on the outside, they appeared to be just another typical Singaporean family, struggling with the everyday pressures of life in the city. But beneath that calm surface lay growing tension, arguments over money, sleepless nights, and a father whose temper had begun to spiral out of control. That June morning, the neighbors would later recall hearing raised voices, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing onto the floor. At first, no one thought much of it. After all, every family fights. But as the hours passed, and the flat remained eerily silent, an unsettling sense of dread began to creep in. By late afternoon, the unmistakable smell of something foul began seeping into the corridor. It was thick, metallic, and nauseating, and it came from the family's unit. Concerned, a neighbor decided to knock on the door. When no one answered, she called the police. Moments later, officers arrived at the scene and forced their way inside. What they found would send shockwaves through the quiet neighborhood, and soon, the entire nation. The moment the police pushed open the door, a wave of stench hit them, the unmistakable, sickly mix of decomposition and stale air. The flat was dim, the curtains drawn tight, and the air conditioning still running. Everything looked frozen in time. On the dining table sat half-finished plates of food, and a child's toy car lay overturned on the floor. But as the officers moved deeper into the living room, Their flashlights swept across a horrifying sight. Lying motionless on the floor was the body of a woman, her face pale and lifeless, streaked with dark stains. Nearby, in one of the bedrooms, were the two young children, a boy and a girl, both lying side by side on their beds, eerily still under the covers, as though asleep. But they weren't sleeping. Within moments, the scene was sealed off. Paramedics confirmed what the officers already feared. All three were dead. The only person missing was the father. News spread fast. By evening, the once quiet Ishan block was swarming with police, forensic teams, and reporters trying to piece together what had happened behind those doors. Investigators quickly learned that the father, 37-year-old Go-Shong Hewitt fictionalized name, had not shown up for work that day. His colleagues said he'd seemed distant in recent weeks, complaining about financial struggles and arguing constantly with his wife. What truly alarmed detectives, however, was what they found inside the master bedroom, a handwritten note placed carefully on the bedside table. It was short and cryptic. "I'm sorry. I couldn't do this anymore. They'll be better off this way." The handwriting matched Go's. With that, police launched an island-wide manhunt. Checkpoints were alerted, and officers were deployed to bus terminals, MRT stations, and coastal areas in case Go tried to flee Singapore. But as the hours passed, with no sign of him, investigators began to suspect something else, that perhaps he hadn't gone far at all. Later that night, a breakthrough came when a team searching the nearby forested area along Yishan Avenue 9 stumbled upon a horrifying discovery. Beneath a thick cluster of bushes, they found the body of a man hanging from a tree branch, his face unrecognizable, but his wallet confirmed his identity. It was Go. The case was ruled a murder-suicide. According to the investigation, Go had strangled his wife during an argument, then turned his rage toward his children before ending his own life hours later. The tragedy shocked the nation, not only because of its brutality, but because of how eerily ordinary the family had seemed. In the days that followed, the neighborhood was engulfed in grief. Neighbors gathered at the void deck with candles and white chrysanthemums, whispering prayers for the lost mother and children. Some couldn't help but wonder if someone had intervened earlier. Could the tragedy have been prevented? In the years following the conviction of Yap Hua, Singapore's legal and social landscapes underwent a quiet but profound transformation. The sheer magnitude of his crimes and the vulnerability of his victims forced both the government and society to confront an uncomfortable truth, that even in one of the safest nations in the world, evil could infiltrate through the most ordinary of channels. A social media message, a friendly smile, a false promise of mentorship. After the trial, the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Singapore Police Force initiated a series of reforms targeting online safety and child protection. Specialized units within the Cybercrime Command were expanded, and investigators began collaborating closely with social media platforms to detect suspicious grooming behaviors before they could escalate into abuse. At the same time, new legislation was introduced under the Penal Code Amendment Act, which imposed harsher penalties on sexual crimes involving minors and digital exploitation. Schools, too, became key front lines in the fight against online predators. By 2015, primary and secondary students across the country were attending cyber wellness programs, learning how to recognize manipulation tactics, protect their privacy online, and report inappropriate behavior. Teachers were trained to identify warning signs of grooming and trauma among students, while parents were urged to take a more active role in monitoring their children's online activities. Yet for all the policies and preventive measures, the emotional toll of the case remained. The families of Yap's victims struggled to rebuild a sense of normalcy. Some of the survivors, now adults, have spoken out anonymously about their experiences, not to relive the pain, but to prevent others from enduring the same horror. One victim described his recovery as a lifelong process of learning to trust again, Psychologists and trauma specialists also took note of the case, using it as a catalyst to push for better mental health support systems for victims of sexual abuse. Non-profit organizations such as Safe Singapore and PAVE began offering free counseling services for young survivors, emphasizing early intervention and long-term care. Slowly, Singapore's social support network evolved to become more compassionate, more vigilant, and more proactive. The story of Yap Wong Wah is not merely one of crime and punishment. It is also a story of awakening. It exposed the hidden dangers of the digital age and the vulnerability of children in an interconnected world. It showed how technology, when left unchecked, could become a weapon in the hands of predators. But it also demonstrated the power of awareness, education, and collective vigilance. Today, more than a decade since the arrest that shocked the nation, Yap remains behind bars, serving out his sentence in one of Singapore's high-security prisons. His name has faded from the headlines, but the memory of what he did continues to linger, a grim reminder of the darkness that can thrive in silence, and the importance of speaking out before it's too late. As one police investigator later reflected, "We cannot undo what happened, but we can make sure it never happens again." And in that promise forged from tragedy and loss, Singapore found a renewed sense of purpose: to protect its children, to guard its digital borders, and to ensure that monsters like Yap Wong Wah would never again find refuge in the shadows. This has been the story of Yap Wong Wah, the man who hid behind the screen, who wore the mask of a friend, and who preyed on innocence. His actions left scars, not only on his victims but also on the conscience of an entire nation. Through his crimes, Singapore learned a painful lesson: that safety is not merely about locked doors or quiet streets. It's about vigilance, awareness, and the courage to speak when something feels wrong. To this day, the case of Yap Wong Wah serves as a chilling reminder of how easily trust can be weaponized, and how critical it is to teach our children that not everyone who calls themselves a friend online truly is one. But it is also a story of resilience, of families who refused to stay silent, of investigators who pursued the truth relentlessly, and of a society that refused to let darkness define it. Out of horror came change. Out of pain came progress. And perhaps that is the most important takeaway of all, that every tragedy carries within it the chance to build something safer, stronger, and more aware. You've been listening to Hands, Asian True Crime Stories of Humanity, Morality, and the Thin Line that separates good from evil. Join us next time as we explore another tale from the heart of Asia, where truth is often stranger and far more haunting than fiction. Would you like me to create a story for next, continuing in this same dark, documentary style? I can suggest a few real-life Singapore or Asian cases that would fit perfectly with this tone, ChatGPT said. Perfect. Here's the continuation of your narrative, written in the same tone, pacing, and structure as the rest of your story. Factual, emotionally restrained, and consistent with the true crime documentary or podcast script style you've been building. On February 4th, 2010, Yap had arranged to meet with a 13-year-old boy at the Hougang swimming complex. The exact purpose of their meeting was never officially stated in court documents, but investigators later determined that the encounter had been meticulously planned in advance. The boy, who lived nearby, had been communicating with Yap online for several weeks. Through his fabricated persona, Yap had convinced the young teenager that he was an 18-year-old student, someone who could relate to his interests and who wanted to hang out as friends. When the boy arrived at the swimming complex after school, Yap greeted him warmly, maintaining the facade of an older brother figure. But once they were inside, the tone shifted. Yap lured the boy to a secluded restroom, where he committed a series of indecent acts before leaving the area as if nothing had happened. Later that night, he uploaded the recorded footage of the encounter to his private folders, categorizing it by name, age, and year. Just like all his previous victims, it was this same chilling level of organization that later helped prosecutors piece together the full extent of Yap's actions. His laptop contained not only explicit videos, but also handwritten notes, short summaries of each victim, their schools, their interests, and how they met. Some files even included screenshots of their Facebook conversations, preserved as if they were trophies. The investigation further revealed that Yap had been careful to vary the meeting locations. His encounters took place across multiple parts of Singapore, in public restrooms at malls like Parkway Parade and Tampines Mall, in hotel rooms booked under fake names, and occasionally at his rented flat in Pasir Ris. Each meeting followed the same pattern: long online grooming, an invitation masked as friendship, and finally, assault. As more evidence surfaced, it became clear that Yap's crimes were not acts of impulse. They were the product of methodical planning and psychological manipulation. Investigators described him as a high-functioning predator, someone who understood human behavior well enough to exploit it. His victims, mostly boys, between 11 and 15, came from ordinary families, some from middle-income households, others from more modest backgrounds. Many of them were active on social media, curious, and trusting exactly the kind of traits Yap knew how to exploit. During the court proceedings, prosecutors emphasized that Yap's actions were a sustained and systematic campaign of sexual exploitation, one that had continued undetected for more than 2.5 years. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Yap suffered from deep-seated psychological trauma stemming from his own abuse as a child. However, the presiding judge made it clear that such a background, while tragic, did not excuse the magnitude of his crimes. In March 2015, after years of legal deliberations, Yap Wonghua was convicted on 32 counts of sexual offenses, with the remaining charges taken into consideration during sentencing. The court described his actions as a calculated betrayal of trust, carried out with precision and persistence. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison and 24 strokes of the cane, one of the harshest penalties ever imposed in Singapore for sexual crimes against minors. For the victims and their families, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but not closure. The trauma left behind by his actions would take years to heal. Some of the boys required long-term counseling. Others struggled in silence, unable to trust adults or form normal relationships. The damage, both psychological and emotional, was immeasurable. Yet, from the darkness of this case emerged a renewed national commitment to child protection. Authorities strengthened cooperation between law enforcement and social media platforms, introduced tighter regulations on online grooming, and rolled out nationwide education programs on cyber safety for children and parents alike. Yap Wonghua's case remains one of the most significant child exploitation cases in Singapore's history, not only for its scale, but also for how it forced the nation to confront the hidden dangers of the digital world in the years that followed. The name Yap Wonghua became synonymous with one of Singapore's darkest criminal chapters, a stark reminder of how technology, when misused, could turn into a weapon against the most vulnerable. His crimes were not just about physical violation. They were about betrayal, manipulation, and the exploitation of trust in the digital age. The case sparked widespread discussions across the country. Schools began implementing new cyber awareness programs, teaching students how to recognize the signs of online grooming and to report suspicious interactions immediately. Parents were encouraged to become more involved in their children's digital lives, understanding that danger could lurk behind even the friendliest online messages. The Singapore Police Force's Technology Crime Division also underwent significant restructuring after the case. New specialized units were established to track and monitor sexual predators operating on social media platforms, employing digital forensics and data tracing to identify hidden networks of exploitation. The government worked closely with international partners to ensure that online offenders could no longer hide behind fake profiles or foreign IP addresses. In 2016, just a year after Yap's sentencing, Singapore introduced enhanced laws under the Penal Code Amendment Act, strengthening penalties for child sexual grooming and possession of obscene materials involving minors. These legal reforms were a direct outcome of lessons learned from Yap's case, marking a turning point in how the justice system approached sexual crimes against children in the digital sphere. But perhaps the most profound impact of all was on the victims themselves, the boys who had been robbed of their innocence by someone they believed was a friend. Many struggled with feelings of shame and confusion for years, haunted by the thought that they might somehow be to blame. Yet through counseling, family support, and the collective outpouring of empathy from the community, several of them found the courage to speak up, helping to spread awareness about grooming and abuse. In interviews conducted years later, social workers who worked with the victims described them as resilient. One counselor said, "They were broken, yes, but they refused to be defined by what happened. They wanted to make sure no one else would ever fall into the same trap." Today, Singapore stands as one of the safest nations in the world, both physically and digitally. But behind that safety lies a history shaped by painful lessons. The Sepio's oil tanker explosion of 1978 taught the nation about the catastrophic consequences of negligence. The case of Yap Wonghua in 2012 revealed the silent dangers that can hide behind a computer screen. Both tragedies, though vastly different, share a common thread. They remind us that safety, whether in the workplace or online, must never be taken for granted. And as the world continues to evolve, these stories endure as part of Singapore's collective memory, a warning that even in the most orderly societies, evil can still find a way in, if vigilance ever falters. Because sometimes, the greatest threats don't come from what we see in front of us, but from what we choose not to see. On August 27, 2015, after nearly 3 years of legal proceedings, the court finally handed down its verdict. Yap Wonghua, then 32 years old, stood before the judge as the full weight of his crimes was laid bare. He was convicted on 10 principal charges, including multiple counts of sexual assault, exploitation of minors, and the possession and distribution of obscene materials involving children. The remaining charges, 66 in total, were taken into consideration during sentencing. As the verdict was read aloud, the courtroom fell silent. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, while parents who had attended the hearing listened in disbelief. For many, it was almost unfathomable that one man, someone who appeared so ordinary, could commit such extraordinary evil. The prosecution described Yap's actions as a sustained and calculated campaign of exploitation, emphasizing that his crimes were not impulsive, but deliberate, systematic, and meticulously planned. They argued that he preyed on the innocence of boys who were too young to comprehend what was happening to them, and that his videotaping of the abuse revealed a disturbing degree of control and sadism. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded for leniency. They cited Yap's traumatic past, the abuse he suffered at the hands of his schoolteacher, his social isolation, and his mental health struggles as factors that shaped his behavior. But the judge was unmoved. When the final sentence was passed, it made headlines nationwide. Yap Wonghua was sentenced to 30 years in prison and 24 strokes of the cane, one of the harshest punishments ever imposed for sexual crimes in Singapore at the time. In his closing remarks, the presiding judge said, "You did not stumble into wrongdoing. You engineered it. You built lies, one after another, to draw innocent children into your grasp. You destroyed lives to feed your own desires." Yap's expression remained unreadable as the sentence was delivered. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his once boyish face now emotionless, eyes fixed on the floor. For the families of the victims, it was a moment of bittersweet closure, justice, at last. though the scars of his actions would linger for a lifetime. Outside the courthouse, social workers and child protection advocates gathered to speak to the press. They warned that Yap's case was not an isolated one. It was a wake-up call. In a world where predators could hide behind screens, the battlefield had shifted. The Ministry of Education soon announced new measures in schools. Digital safety lessons were added to the curriculum, teaching students how to recognize grooming tactics. Parents received guidance on monitoring online activity without breaching trust. Teachers were trained to spot behavioral changes that might indicate abuse. Meanwhile, community organizations like the Singapore Children's Society launched nationwide campaigns encouraging victims of sexual abuse to come forward, assuring them that help was available and that their voices mattered. Years later, in retrospective documentaries and true crime analyses, the Yap case would be referenced as a defining moment, not just because of its horror, but because of how it transformed public awareness. In interviews, one investigator who worked on the case recalled, "What struck me most wasn't how careful he was, it was how ordinary he seemed. You could pass him on the street and never suspect a thing. That's what made him dangerous." The digital age had created new opportunities for connection, but also new ways for predators to exploit trust. The internet could bridge distances, but it could also hide monsters behind friendly messages and smiling profile pictures. For the survivors, healing took time. Many underwent years of therapy and counseling. Some found solace in advocacy, sharing their stories anonymously to help others recognize the signs of grooming. Others chose to remain silent, seeking peace and privacy. But collectively, their pain led to progress. Because of them, Singapore's cyber laws grew stronger, and its children became safer. Today, more than a decade since Yap's arrest, the story still serves as a grim reminder that evil often hides behind a familiar face, and that vigilance must never fade, even in the safest of cities. Behind the screens of social media, not every smile is real, and sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who know exactly how to look like a friend. The dangers of online grooming and the deceptive tactics used by predators like Yap Wong. Public campaigns were swiftly launched across schools, community centers, and social media platforms. The Ministry of Education, in collaboration with the Singapore Police Force, began implementing digital literacy and cyber safety programs to educate students on how to recognize, avoid, and report online exploitation. These campaigns encouraged open dialogue between children and parents, breaking the long-standing stigma surrounding sexual abuse and victimization. Parents were urged to take an active interest in their children's digital interactions, to monitor friend requests and messages, and, most importantly, to foster an environment of trust so that young victims could speak up without fear or shame. Meanwhile, advocacy groups and psychologists emphasized that the psychological damage inflicted upon Yap's victims would likely linger for years. Many of them had to undergo trauma therapy and counseling sessions to rebuild confidence and overcome the guilt and confusion that often accompany abuse at such a young age. For some, even the sound of a phone notification or a Facebook message could trigger flashbacks of the grooming process. The court's decision to hand Yap one of the harshest sentences ever imposed for sexual crimes sent a strong and symbolic message across Singapore that such acts of predation, especially those targeting children, would never be tolerated. The case prompted a comprehensive review of the nation's cyber safety infrastructure, leading to the strengthening of Section 376 of the Penal Code, which covers sexual offenses against minors. It also inspired the creation of dedicated cybercrime units specializing in digital forensic analysis, focusing on identifying and dismantling online networks of sexual predators. In the years following Yap's sentencing, Singapore's internet landscape continued to evolve rapidly. Social media became more complex, and so did the dangers that came with it. But thanks to the painful lessons learned from the Yap case, schools, families, and law enforcement grew more vigilant. Teachers began noticing the subtle signs of grooming, sudden changes in a student's behavior, secrecy around phone use, or an unusual attachment to an unknown online friend. By 2020, the number of reported cases of online child exploitation in Singapore had declined significantly, largely due to early intervention programs and cross-agency cooperation between educators, police, and social workers. The case had, in many ways, reshaped how the nation viewed digital safety, not merely as a technical issue, but as a matter of public health, mental well-being, and social responsibility. Despite all these reforms, the story of Yap Wong Wah remains a painful scar in Singapore's collective memory. It reminds the public that evil often disguises itself as kindness, and that predators rarely appear as monsters at first glance. To the unsuspecting, Yap was just another friendly face, a mentor, a brother figure, a person who listened. But behind the screen, he was something far darker. For his 31 victims in Singapore and the 14 others in Malaysia, the trauma he left behind would take years, perhaps decades, to heal. Yet their courage in coming forward ultimately saved others from the same fate. Their stories sparked a movement, one that continues to protect countless children today. In the end, Yap's case was not just about punishment. It was about awareness, education, and reform. It forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, technology, and the vulnerability of youth in an increasingly connected world. And as Singapore moved forward, one truth remained clear. No matter how advanced technology becomes, the simplest safeguard will always be vigilance, and the willingness to listen when a child says, "Something isn't right." By the time the ship had set sail from Tacloban, the atmosphere aboard was a chaotic mix of excitement and exhaustion. Families huddled together on narrow bunks, children slept in the aisles, and groups of young men sat near the railings sharing cigarettes and stories. For most passengers, discomfort was a small price to pay for the promise of being home for Christmas. As the Dona Paz cruised through the calm waters of the Tabla Strait that night, few could have imagined the nightmare that awaited them. The sea was unusually still, the sky moonless but clear. At the same time, several nautical miles away, an oil tanker named Mount Vector was making its way through the same channel. The Vector was carrying more than 8,000 barrels of petroleum products, including gasoline, diesel, and kerosene, all highly flammable cargo. According to later investigations, the Vector was operating without a proper license. And worse, its crew was inadequately trained. Its safety and navigation equipment were in poor condition, and its radio was reportedly malfunctioning. These lapses set the stage for disaster. At approximately 10:30 p.m. on December 20th, 1987, the Dona Pass was midway through its voyage when the unthinkable happened. Passengers who were awake later recalled seeing a bright light in the distance growing larger by the second. Then, in an instant, a massive explosion tore through the darkness. The impact threw hundreds of passengers off their feet as the Dona Pass collided with the Mount Vector, causing the tanker's flammable cargo to ignite. Within seconds, both vessels were engulfed in flames. Burning oil spilled onto the sea, turning the surrounding waters into a fiery inferno. Survivors described the scene as a sea of fire, where people who jumped overboard found themselves surrounded by floating flames. The smoke was so thick that breathing became nearly impossible. Inside the Dona Pass, chaos erupted. The ship's lighting system failed, plunging the overcrowded decks into darkness. People screamed and trampled one another in a desperate attempt to reach the lifeboats. But in a horrifying twist, most of the lifeboats were locked, and the crew was nowhere to be found. There was no public announcement, no alarm, and no sign of an organized evacuation. Odia clung to her father, Salvador, as they struggled to find a way out through the choking smoke. The heat was unbearable, and the walls seemed to pulse with fire. Salvador wrapped his jacket around his daughter's face to shield her from the smoke as they made their way toward the railing. Around them, hundreds of passengers cried, prayed, or shouted names of their loved ones who had vanished into the crowd. Moments later, the Dona Pass tilted sharply to one side. Salvador knew they had no choice. They had to jump. Holding Audia's hand tightly, he leaped into the burning waters below. The heat of the sea scalded their skin, and pieces of flaming debris floated all around them. For hours, they kicked and paddled through the darkness, surrounded by screams that grew fewer and fewer as the night went on. By dawn, the once proud ship had vanished beneath the waves. The fiery glow had dimmed, replaced by a haunting stillness and the faint smell of oil lingering on the wind. Only a few survivors remained, clinging to pieces of floating wreckage and praying for rescue. When Coast Guard vessels finally arrived the next morning, they were met with an unimaginable sight. Thousands of bodies floating on the water, many burned beyond recognition. Out of an estimated 4,386 people aboard, only 24 survived, minus 21 from the Dona Pass and 3 from the Mount Vector. It remains the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history, surpassing even the sinking of the Titanic. The tragedy sparked outrage across the Philippines. Questions flooded the media. Why had the Dona Pass been allowed to carry more than twice its legal capacity? Why did the crew fail to respond during the fire? And how could a tanker carrying thousands of barrels of fuel be permitted to sail in such unsafe condition? In the aftermath, investigators discovered that no radio distress signal had ever been sent. Neither ship was equipped with a functioning communication system at the time of the collision. Survivors reported that the Dona Pass's crew had been watching television and drinking shortly before the impact. The captain, it turned out, was not even on the bridge when disaster struck. Public anger reached boiling point as officials from Sulpicio Lines, the shipping company that owned the Dona Pass, attempted to downplay responsibility. For many Filipinos, the tragedy was not just an accident, it was a national disgrace, a symbol of corruption, negligence, and greed. In the days that followed the tragedy, the Philippine Coast Guard, Navy, and local fishermen worked tirelessly to recover bodies and search for any remaining survivors. But by the end of December 1987, hope had all but faded. The sea yielded more than 1,500 charred corpses, many of them so badly burned that identification was impossible. Most of the victims were buried in mass graves on nearby islands. Among the few who lived to tell the tale was Salvador Baxel and his young daughter Odia, when they were finally rescued by a passing cargo vessel. Their bodies were covered in burns, their clothes melted to their skin. They had drifted for hours in oil-slicked waters, clutching pieces of debris while praying not to sink. The trauma would haunt them for life, as rescue operations turned into recovery efforts. Questions about accountability consumed the nation. Newspapers called the disaster the Sea of Fire and the Floating Inferno. Radio anchors demanded to know why the Dona Pass had been carrying more than twice its approved passenger limit. Official records revealed that the ship had clearance for 1,518 people, but investigators estimated that at least 4,300 were on board that night. Many of them unregistered passengers who had bribed crew members to let them board without tickets. This revelation shocked the public. It was not merely a maritime accident. It was a portrait of systemic corruption, negligence, and disregard for safety. The Philippine Coast Guard launched an inquiry, working alongside the Maritime Industry Authority Marina. Their findings were damning. The Mount Vector, the oil tanker that collided with the ferry, was unseaworthy, undermanned, and operating without a valid license. Its radio had been broken for months, and its crew of 11 men were poorly trained. On the other hand, the Dona Pass was found to have no proper emergency procedures, no functioning radio, and locked life vests, and lifeboats that trapped passengers during the Fire. The collision occurred because both ships were sailing without radar and with inadequate lookout crews in one of the busiest sea lanes in the Philippines. Neither vessel saw the other until it was too late. In early 1988, a joint task force concluded that the primary blame lay with the owners of the Mount Vector, whose negligence in maintaining safety and navigation equipment directly caused the collision. However, Sulpicio Lines, the operator of the Dona Paz, was not absolved. The company's decision to allow overloading and its failure to train crew members on emergency response procedures were cited as key factors that made the tragedy far worse for the families of the victims. Justice proved elusive. Years of litigation followed as both shipping companies deflected responsibility. In 1992, a Philippine court ordered the Vector Shipping Corporation and its Tora, Caltex Philippines, to pay damages to the victims' families. But the decision was contested for years, and many families received little or no compensation. Some survivors said that the value of a lost loved one was reduced to a few thousand pesos, a cruel reminder of how cheaply human life was valued. Public outrage eventually forced the government to tighten maritime regulations. By the early 1990s, new laws required ships to maintain accurate passenger manifests, radio communication systems, and regular safety inspections before departure. However, critics argued that enforcement remained weak, pointing out that the same operator, Sulpicio Lines, would later be involved in 3 more major maritime disasters, including the 2008 sinking of MV Princess of the Stars, which claimed over 800 lives. For Adia Bep, who had survived the inferno as a young girl, the memories never faded. She recalled how, after the explosion, the sea was burning and people were screaming, and then it all went quiet. Her father, Salvador, rarely spoke about that night again. In interviews years later, she said, "Every Christmas, when I hear people laughing, I remember those who didn't make it home." The sinking of the Dona Paz remains etched in history as the world's deadliest peacetime maritime disaster, a catastrophe that exposed the fatal consequences of greed and complacency. More than 4 decades later, its name still evokes a painful lesson that in the pursuit of profit, the cost of human life must never be forgotten. Was thick with oil, coating their skin and making it difficult to breathe. The acrid stench of burning fuel filled the air as screams echoed across the darkness. Pieces of debris, wooden planks, plastic containers, and charred luggage floated past them. Some passengers clung to these fragments, crying out for help that would never come. Salvador held on tightly to his daughter, whispering prayers as waves of heat rolled over them. "Hold your breath," he told her. "Don't look back." But despite his warning, Adia turned her head and saw the horror behind them. The Dona Paz completely engulfed in flames, its structure glowing like molten metal. The ship's name was no longer visible, only a massive inferno on the black horizon. For hours, the sea burned. The oil that had spilled from the Vector spread across the water's surface, creating a carpet of fire that moved with the tide. Every attempt to swim away brought survivors dangerously close to new patches of burning fuel. Some could be heard screaming for their children, others calling for God. Then, one by one, their voices faded into the night. By dawn on December 21st, the once grand ferry had disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only smoldering debris and the faint smell of gasoline lingering in the air. The first rescuers to arrive were fishermen from the nearby island of Mar. They had seen the glow of the fire from miles away and steered their small boats toward it, expecting perhaps a burning vessel, but what they found instead was beyond comprehension. Floating among the wreckage were hundreds of bodies, men, women, and children burned beyond recognition of the more than 4,300 people believed to be on board. Only 26 were pulled from the water alive, 24 passengers from the Dona Paz and 2 crew members from the Mount Vector. The survivors were rushed to hospitals in Catbalogan and Manila, their bodies covered in burns and oil. Many could not speak for days, traumatized by what they had witnessed. News of the tragedy spread quickly. Radio stations across the Philippines broke into regular programming, and by midday, newspapers carried the headline, "Sea of Fire, Thousands Dead in Donapa's Disaster." Families crowded the ports, desperately waiting for news of loved ones. But there were no lists, no official passenger manifest. Many of the dead had never been registered to begin with. Some had boarded illegally, others as stowaways. For thousands of families, there would be no bodies to bury, only the lingering scent of smoke and salt. The Philippine Coast Guard launched immediate rescue operations, though rough seas and the sheer scale of the disaster hampered their efforts. When divers finally reached the wreckage days later, they found the hull of the Donapaz resting at a depth of 545 meters, far beyond the reach of most recovery teams. Inside the sunken ship were still hundreds, perhaps thousands, of victims trapped in their cabins. The tragedy quickly drew international attention. Foreign correspondents compared it to the Titanic, but in reality, the Donapaz was far worse, claiming more than 3 times as many lives. Maritime experts called it the worst peacetime maritime disaster in history. In the weeks that followed, both the Philippine government and global maritime organizations began probing the causes of the collision. Investigators soon uncovered a grim reality. Both ships had been operating in blatant violation of safety standards. The Donapaz had no functioning radio, insufficient lifeboats, and no emergency drills for passengers. The Mount Vector, meanwhile, was found to be unlicensed, undermanned, and carrying highly flammable cargo without proper clearance. Even more shocking was the revelation that the Donapaz was carrying at least twice its legal capacity. Over 3,800 unlisted passengers had bribed crew members to board. Many of them were soldiers, students, and families returning home for Christmas. In the face of overwhelming evidence, outrage swept across the nation. Funerals were held en masse in Tacloban, Samar, and Manila. Entire families were wiped out, and communities were left in mourning. Survivors like Odia Baxel described the night as hell on water. She recalled the sound of people screaming as they burned, and how the ocean, normally a symbol of life for islanders, had turned into their grave dot. Oversight surrounding the Mount Vector painted a picture of greed, indifference, and complete disregard for human life. Investigators concluded that the oil tanker should never have been allowed to operate, yet it had, under the complacent eyes of those meant to enforce maritime safety. But while the Vector was undeniably unfit to sail, the blame did not rest on one vessel alone. The probe also turned toward the MV Donapaz and its operator, Sulpicio Lines Inc. The company, already known for previous maritime incidents, was soon accused of gross negligence. Survivors and witnesses testified that the Donapaz had no functioning radio communication, making it impossible for the crew to send a distress signal after the collision. Even more damning was the discovery that the ferry was overcrowded by several thousand passengers, far exceeding its official capacity of 1,518, including crew. The official passenger manifest listed only 1,493 names. Yet based on survivor accounts and the number of bodies recovered, the estimated count exceeded 4,300. Most of the unlisted passengers had bribed crew members to board the already packed ship. The tragedy was no longer seen as a mere accident. It was a man-made disaster, the catastrophic result of corruption, complacency, and greed. When the final report was released, the Philippine Coast Guard declared both ships equally at fault. The Vector, for sailing unlicensed and inadequately manned. The Donapaz, for reckless overloading, lack of safety equipment, and absence of proper communication systems. Yet, even as investigators laid out the facts, justice proved elusive. The owners of Vector Shipping went bankrupt shortly after the incident, and Sulpicio Lines, despite national outrage, managed to avoid criminal liability. Civil suits dragged on for years, but in the end, very few families ever received compensation. For thousands of grieving relatives, there were no bodies to bury. The oil-soaked corpses that washed ashore were too burned, too mutilated to be identified. Most victims were buried in mass graves along the shores of Marindoc and while others were forever lost to the depths of the sea. Journalists dubbed the disaster the Titanic of Asia. International maritime authorities called it the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history. But for the Filipino people, it was far more than a headline. It was a wound that cut through generations. In the years that followed, the tragedy spurred changes in maritime safety regulations. The government introduced stricter enforcement of vessel inspections and required updated safety drills for crew and passengers alike. But many argued that these reforms came too late, a reaction to a tragedy that could have been prevented if only the rules had been followed. Among the few who lived to tell the story was Odia Bet. In interviews years later, she recalled the harrowing night in haunting detail, the sound of people screaming as the fire spread, the unbearable heat, and the moment she realized her father had stopped speaking while they clung to the debris. Though Salvador Baxel survived the initial rescue, his lungs were severely damaged from inhaling burning fuel. He passed away a few months later. When asked what she remembered most, Odia simply said, "The sea was glowing orange that night. But it wasn't beautiful. It was the color of death." Her words captured the haunting legacy of the MV Dona Paz disaster, a reminder that sometimes the worst tragedies are not acts of fate, but consequences of human failure. However, despite the mounting evidence, one crucial question still lingered. How could such a tragedy have been allowed to happen in the first place? Authorities had already uncovered the truth behind the overloading. Yet the scale of negligence pointed to deeper systemic failures. The investigation soon revealed a troubling reality, that corruption, complacency, and a culture of impunity had long plagued the maritime industry in the Philippines. Regulations that should have protected passengers were either ignored or poorly enforced. Officials tasked with inspecting vessels often turned a blind eye in exchange for bribes, while shipping companies continued to profit at the expense of safety. The Dona Paz, once hailed as a reliable passenger ferry, was in fact a floating time bomb, a ship that lacked proper communication equipment, emergency drills, and even functional lifeboats. By the time the findings were made public, the outrage was palpable. Families of the victims demanded accountability, not only from Sulpicio Lines, the owner of the Dona Paz, but also from the Philippine Coast Guard and the Maritime Industry Authority, whose oversight failures had allowed the ship to sail in such dangerous conditions. Yet, as the investigation dragged on, hope for justice began to fade. Legal loopholes, missing documentation, and bureaucratic red tape clouded the process. Sulpicio Lines maintained that the Mount Vector was at fault, arguing that the collision had been unavoidable. Meanwhile, Vector Shipping, the owner of the tanker, declared bankruptcy, leaving no one to hold accountable. In the end, both companies were found to share responsibility, the Vector for operating an unseaworthy vessel with unqualified crew, and Sulpicio Lines for allowing the Dona Paz to carry thousands more than it was designed for. But despite the official ruling, no criminal charges were ever filed. For the thousands of grieving families, this outcome was a bitter reminder that in the Philippines, justice often sank just as deeply as the ships that carried their loved ones. These tragedies stand as haunting reminders of the Philippines' long and painful struggle to ensure safety at sea, despite the passage of decades. The lessons from the Dona Paz disaster remain as relevant as ever, a stark testament to the deadly consequences of negligence, greed, and systemic failure for thousands of families. The sinking of the Dona Paz was not just a maritime accident, it was a national trauma. Each Christmas season, memories of that fateful night resurface. The burning waters of Tabla Strait, the cries for help swallowed by the dark, and the faces of loved ones who never made it home. The tragedy forced the government to reevaluate its maritime policies, prompting the establishment of stricter safety regulations and more rigorous vessel inspections. Yet, enforcement remained inconsistent. Many of the same issues that plagued the shipping industry in the 1980s, corruption, poor oversight, and profit-driven negligence continued to persist in later decades. The Dona Paz remains the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history, with an estimated 4,386 lives lost, more than triple the number of casualties on the Titanic. And while the Supreme Court's final ruling in 1999 officially placed the blame solely on the Mount Vector, many Filipinos still believe that the decision failed to deliver true justice. To them, the tragedy was not just caused by one defective ship or an unlicensed crew, but by a broken system that had long prioritized money over human life. Today, at memorials built along the coasts of Leyte and Mint, survivors and relatives still gather every December to light candles and offer prayers for the victims. The sea that once carried so much death has become a place of remembrance, calm, but never forgotten. Despite its towering presence, Rana Plaza was a ticking time bomb. From the outside, it appeared as a beacon of progress, a symbol of Bangladesh's booming garment industry. But beneath its glossy surface lay a foundation built on corruption, negligence, and greed. Originally approved for only 5 stories, the building was illegally expanded to 8. Its foundations, designed for light commercial use, were never meant to bear the weight of thousands of industrial sewing machines and heavy generators. To make matters worse, substandard materials had been used during construction. Every extra floor that was added, every new factory that moved in, pushed the structure closer to collapse. By early 2013, Rana Plaza housed 5 garment factories, a bank, several shops, and small apartments. These factories supplied garments to dozens of well-known international brands, producing clothing that would end up on shelves in the US, Europe, and beyond. The workers, mostly young women, earning less than $40 a month, had little choice but to endure unsafe conditions. On April 23, 2013, the first clear signs of danger appeared. Workers and local residents noticed deep cracks snaking along the building's walls and support columns. Television crews arrived to document the alarming sight, broadcasting the footage nationwide. Panic rippled through the area as factory owners and employees feared the worst. That afternoon, engineers from the Savar municipality inspected the building and declared it unsafe for use. Shops and the bank located on the lower floors were promptly shut down. But for the garment factories above, business was business, under immense pressure to meet production deadlines for foreign clients. Factory managers allegedly acting on orders from Sol Rana. The building's owner instructed workers to return the next morning. Many workers protested, terrified that the building might collapse. Some refused to go back, but others, desperate to keep their jobs, complied. As one survivor later recalled, our managers said, "If you don't come to work tomorrow, you won't get paid this month." The following morning, April 24th, 2013, just after 8:45 a.m., tragedy struck. A sudden power outage prompted the activation of several diesel generators on the upper floors. Moments later, a low rumbling filled the building, then, with a deafening roar, Rana Plaza crumbled to the ground in less than 90 seconds. The collapse was so violent that it registered like an earthquake. Clouds of concrete dust and fabric fibers filled the air, blotting out the sun. Thousands were trapped beneath the rubble. Those who survived the initial collapse screamed for help from the darkness, their cries blending with the sound of metal grinding and concrete settling. Within minutes, locals and survivors rushed to the scene, with bare hands, shovels, and makeshift tools. They began digging through the debris, pulling out survivors, one by one. Rescue workers, army personnel, and firefighters soon joined the effort, but the devastation was beyond imagination. Entire families were wiped out. As days turned into nights, rescuers worked tirelessly, driven by the faint voices still calling out from the wreckage. Some survivors were trapped for more than 2 days before being rescued. One young woman, Reshma Begum, miraculously survived for 17 days, buried beneath the ruins, before she was found. Weak but alive, by the time the last piece of rubble was cleared. 1,134 people were confirmed dead, and over 2,500 were injured. The Rana Plaza collapse had become the deadliest industrial disaster in garment history, and one of the worst structural failures in modern times. International outrage was immediate. Images of mangled machinery, torn garments, and lifeless bodies circulated across global media. Questions mounted. How could such a disaster happen again, after years of repeated warnings and smaller tragedies? Who would be held accountable for these thousands of innocent lives lost? Within moments, the 8-story Rana Plaza building began to disintegrate. The floor beneath Rupali's feet buckled violently, sending her and her co-workers crashing to the ground. The deafening roar of twisting metal and crumbling concrete drowned out the screams around her. In less than a minute, the world she knew, the chatter of her friends, the hum of sewing machines, the warmth of the morning light, was replaced by darkness, dust, and silence. Rupali tried to move, but her legs were pinned beneath debris. All around her, muffled cries and faint moans echoed through the ruins. Someone called for help, their voice trembling. Another prayed softly in the dark. The air was thick with concrete dust, making every breath painful. Somewhere nearby, she could hear the hiss of a broken pipe and the faint crackle of a fire. Above ground, chaos erupted. The once bustling street of Savar had turned into a scene of unimaginable horror. The colossal structure that had loomed over the neighborhood now lay flattened, a mountain of rubble and shattered dreams. Thick clouds of dust rose into the sky as onlookers screamed and rushed toward the wreckage. Mothers wept, clutching photographs of their children. Fathers dug with their bare hands, calling out names into the debris. Within hours, the area became a massive rescue site. Soldiers, firefighters, and ordinary citizens joined hands, forming human chains to pass buckets of debris, searching for any sign of life. The stench of concrete dust mixed with sweat and fear. Makeshift tents were set up nearby to serve as first aid centers. Hospitals in Dhaka were soon overwhelmed with the injured bodies covered in wounds, burns, and dust, their clothes torn and stained with blood. For the next few days, the entire nation of Bangladesh held its breath. Rescue teams worked around the clock, using whatever tools they could find, hammers, metal rods, even kitchen utensils, to break through the rubble. Cries for help guided them to survivors trapped in air pockets. Every rescued life was a small miracle. Every lifeless body pulled from the ruins, a painful reminder of the cost of negligence. Rupali survived. She was trapped for nearly 36 hours, her body bruised and bleeding, sustained only by her will to live. When rescuers finally reached her, she was barely conscious. Like many survivors, she had lost close friends and co-workers, people she had eaten lunch with just hours before the collapse. By the end of the rescue operations, the numbers were staggering. 1,134 people had perished, and more than 2,500 others were injured. Families were left shattered. Entire communities plunged into grief. The Rana Plaza collapse became a symbol of everything wrong with the global garment industry, the human cost hidden behind cheap fashion. In the days that followed, anger boiled over. Protesters filled the streets of Dhaka, demanding justice and accountability. International outrage grew, as reports revealed that the factories inside Rana Plaza produced garments for well-known Western brands. Consumers around the world began to question the true price of their clothing. Sol Rana, the building's owner, was caught trying to flee the country and was arrested near the Indian border. Investigations uncovered layers of corruption, falsified permits, ignored safety warnings, and political connections that had allowed Rana to build illegally and operate unchecked. Factory owners had threatened workers to return to their stations despite the visible cracks. The government, under immense global pressure, promised sweeping reforms. Global apparel companies were forced to respond. The Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh, a legally binding agreement between brands and trade unions, was established. Thousands of factories were inspected, and hundreds were shut down for failing to meet safety standards. Yet for many survivors, these measures came too late. For Rupali and the countless others who lived through that day, the scars, physical and emotional, never faded. The collapse of Rana Plaza was more than just a structural failure. It was a collapse of humanity, empathy, and ethics. Every year, on April 24th, families and survivors gather at the site where Rana Plaza once stood. They lay flowers, light candles, and whisper the names of those lost. The rubble is gone, replaced by a memorial, but the memory remains, heavy and haunting. A reminder to the world that fashion should never cost human lives. Designed as a 5-story commercial complex, intended to house small shops and offices, not heavy industrial factories. However, over the years, Sol Rana, the building's owner, legally added 3 additional floors without obtaining structural approval or permits. These upper floors were never engineered to support the immense weight of industrial sewing, machines, large fabric presses, and diesel generators that later filled them. Engineers interviewed during the inquiry explained that each generator alone could exert several tons of dynamic vibration on the concrete slabs. When the building lost power on the morning of April 24, 2013, and those generators roared to life, they shook the weakened structure like a hammer against glass. Combined with the poor quality materials, the overloading of machinery, and the unstable ground beneath, the vibrations became the final trigger in a chain of negligence. Years in the making. Investigators also uncovered how a network of corruption and political protection had allowed Rana Plaza to operate despite repeated warnings. Local officials admitted that building inspectors had either been bribed or intimidated into signing safety clearances. Factory owners, under pressure from foreign clients to meet impossible deadlines, ignored the cracks and ordered workers back to their stations. Several survivors later testified that they had been threatened with loss of pay or termination if they refused to return. The official report painted a devastating picture, a combination of illegal construction, substandard materials, government oversight failure, and corporate greed had led to one of the worst industrial disasters in modern history. It was, as one investigator put it, a collapse not just of concrete, but of conscience. In the aftermath, the government vowed reform. Hundreds of unsafe factories were temporarily shut down, and emergency inspections swept through the garment sector. Yet for the survivors and the families of the 1,134 victims, justice felt distant. Legal proceedings dragged on for years. Many accused, including Sol Rana, were arrested, but the trials moved slowly through a congested court system. Meanwhile, the global fashion industry faced a reckoning. International outrage pushed major brands to sign the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh, a legally binding pact that forced stricter factory inspections and safety improvements. Some progress followed. Thousands of buildings were reinforced, fire exits added, and workers trained in evacuation drills. But critics argued that deeper problems, poverty, wages, union suppression, and relentless foreign demand for fast fashion remained unresolved. For Rupali Akhtar, recovery was long and painful. Her body healed, but nightmares persisted. She spoke in interviews about the deafening roar of that morning, the smell of dust and blood, and the faces of colleagues she would never see again. They told us the building was safe, she whispered once to a reporter. We believed them. Now I know our lives were cheaper than their profits. Today, the site where Rana Plaza once stood is an open field marked by a simple memorial stone. Every April 24th, survivors and families gather there, laying flowers and holding silent vigils. Their message endures: never again. The tragedy of Rana Plaza remains a haunting reminder that beneath the glossy storefronts of the global fashion industry are human lives, and that the true cost of cheap clothing can never be measured in money, but in the memories of those who never came home. Through his greed, arrogance, and total disregard for human life. When officers finally arrested Sola Rana on the morning of April 28, 2013, near the Banapal border crossing with India, the entire nation of Bangladesh erupted in a collective sigh of relief. News of his capture spread rapidly across the country. Images of the once powerful businessman, handcuffed and disheveled, flashed across every television screen. The man who once boasted of political connections and flaunted his wealth was now branded the most hated figure in Bangladesh. Rana was transported back to Dhaka under heavy security, his head bowed as crowds gathered along the roadside to hurl curses and demands for justice. Hang him, hang him. Many shouted, their voices echoing through the streets. For the families of the victims, this moment brought a small sense of vindication, but the pain remained unbearable. Mothers who had lost daughters, fathers who had buried sons, and children left orphaned by the collapse, all wanted answers and accountability that went beyond a single arrest. During interrogation, investigators uncovered the full extent of Rana's corruption. He had used his political influence to silence inspectors and bypass building codes, offering bribes and favors to local officials who turned a blind eye to his illegal expansions. Records showed that the building's construction company had no licensed engineer overseeing the project, and Rana had personally approved the substitution of cheap, weak materials to save costs. What made his actions even more damning was the fact that engineers had warned him just one day before the collapse that the building was unsafe. Instead of closing it permanently, Rana threatened the factory managers with eviction if their workers didn't return to work. The charges against him were severe murder, building code violations, and corruption, each carrying potentially life sentences. In court, Rana remained mostly expressionless, but survivors like Rupali Akhtar testified tearfully about how their pleas for safety had been ignored. He told us to go back inside, one worker said, her voice breaking. He said if we didn't, we'd lose our jobs. But we lost our lives instead. Public outrage grew as details of widespread complicity emerged. Local politicians, inspectors, and even factory owners were found to have played roles in maintaining the deadly system of negligence. The Rana Plaza tragedy exposed not only one man's greed, but also a national crisis of corruption, where profit consistently outweighed human life. Internationally, the collapse triggered a reckoning within the fashion industry. Major global brands that sourced clothing from Rana Plaza's factories, including Primark, Benetton, Mango, and Walmart, faced intense criticism for their role in enabling unsafe working conditions. Under pressure from human rights groups and consumers, many of these companies eventually contributed to a compensation fund for the victims, and signed the Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Building Safety, a landmark agreement designed to ensure that factories met proper safety standards. In Bangladesh, thousands of volunteers, engineers, and soldiers worked for weeks amid the rubble of Rana Plaza, pulling survivors and bodies from the wreckage. The final death toll was staggering: 1,134 people killed and more than 2,500 injured, making it the deadliest garment factory disaster in history. Years later, as the legal cases dragged on, Sol Rana remained imprisoned, awaiting sentencing, while survivors struggled with lifelong injuries and trauma. Memorials were built, and annual vigils are still held on April 24th, where families light candles and recite the names of the dead. The story of Rana Plaza endures as a chilling reminder of what happens when greed eclipses humanity, It stands as both a tragedy and a lesson, one that continues to shape the global conversation about ethical labor, corporate accountability, and the true cost of fashion. In the years that followed the Rana Plaza collapse, the world began to awaken to the dark reality hidden behind the glitter of fast fashion. The tragedy sparked a global reckoning, from the bustling streets of Dhaka to the boardrooms of multinational brands. International pressure mounted, and labor activists demanded justice, fair wages, and safe working conditions for millions of garment workers. Out of the ashes of Rana Plaza came the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh, a landmark agreement that required global brands to ensure the factories they sourced from met rigorous safety standards. Thousands of factories were inspected, hundreds were closed, and new building codes were introduced. Yet even with these changes, questions still linger about how much has truly changed and whether another disaster could happen again. For the survivors, the scars remain, both seen and unseen. Many still carry the trauma of that morning, the memories of friends and colleagues lost beneath the rubble. But amid the grief, their voices have become symbols of resilience. They remind us that behind every stitched seam and folded fabric lies a story, one that deserves to be told with dignity, fairness, and humanity.